Bullies stripped off her jacket. She threw him down the hall without blinking. Wren Holloway had always been the kind of person who preferred the shadows to the spotlight. At Roosevelt High School in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, she moved through the hallways like a ghost, her slight frame and naturally quiet demeanor making her nearly invisible to most students. Standing barely 5'2" with mousy brown hair that she kept tied back in a simple ponytail, Wren looked like she might blow away in a strong wind. Her oversized sweaters and faded jeans hung loose on her petite frame, and she had a habit of keeping her eyes downcast when walking between classes. What nobody at Roosevelt High knew was that Wren had spent the last 8 years of her life training in Krav Maga and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at her uncle's dojo back in Portland, Oregon. Her uncle, a former Marine, had insisted she learn to defend herself after her parents' messy divorce when she was 10. The training had become her sanctuary, a place where her small size was actually an advantage, where speed and technique mattered more than brute strength. But when her mother remarried and they moved to Iowa 3 months ago, Wren had made a conscious decision to leave that part of herself behind. She wanted a fresh start, a chance to be normal, to blend in and avoid conflict altogether. Roosevelt High was one of those sprawling suburban schools that housed nearly 2,000 students, with its red brick facade and countless hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. The building smelled perpetually of cleaning solution and cafeteria food, and the fluorescent lights cast everything in a harsh, unflattering glow. Wren had chosen this fresh start carefully, deliberately avoiding any mention of her martial arts background to her new classmates and teachers. She wanted peace, not the reputation that came with being known as someone who could fight. Unfortunately, peace was not something that Blake Morrison was inclined to offer anyone, especially not to quiet new students who seemed like easy targets. Blake stood 6'1", with the kind of athletic build that came from 4 years on the varsity football team. His sandy blonde hair was always perfectly styled, and he wore his Letterman jacket like armor, the patches and pins announcing his status to anyone within eyeshot. Blake had ruled Roosevelt High's social hierarchy since his sophomore year, gathering around him a tight circle of followers who eagerly participated in his daily entertainment of making life miserable for anyone he deemed unworthy of his respect. His most loyal lieutenants were Tyler Santos, a stocky wrestler with dark eyes and a cruel smile, and Mason Reed, a basketball player whose tall, lanky frame and sharp features made him look like a predator even when he was standing still. Together, they formed a triumvirate of cruelty that had made countless students' lives miserable over the years, always careful to stay just below the radar of teachers and administrators who preferred to look the other way rather than deal with the complications that came with disciplining star athletes. Wren's first encounter with Blake's crew happened on a Tuesday morning in early October, 3 weeks after she'd started at Roosevelt. She was at her locker, carefully organizing her textbooks for the day, when she felt someone slam into her from behind. Her books scattered across the hallway floor, and she heard the distinctive sound of laughter that she was already beginning to recognize and dread. "Oops," Blake said with mock sincerity, his voice carrying just loud enough for the surrounding students to hear. "Didn't see you there, Mouse. Maybe you should eat a sandwich or something so people can actually notice you." Wren bent down to collect her scattered books, her face burning with embarrassment as other students stepped around her without offering to help. She could feel Blake and his friends watching her, waiting for a reaction, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was exactly the kind of situation she wanted to avoid. She gathered her things quickly and walked away without a word, ignoring the continued snickers behind her. The pattern established itself quickly after that. Blake seemed to have an internal radar for finding Wren during the most crowded times of day, when the maximum number of witnesses would be available to observe her humiliation. In the cafeteria, he would accidentally bump into her while she was carrying her lunch tray, sending food spilling across her clothes and the floor. In the hallways between classes, Tyler would shoulder-check her into the lockers, while Mason made loud comments about how she should watch where she was going. They called her Ghost Girl and Skeleton, making jokes about how she looked like she might disappear entirely if she turned sideways. The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort or even the public embarrassment. It was the way other students reacted, or rather, failed to react. Wren watched as classmates she'd tried to befriend would suddenly find their phones fascinating whenever Blake's crew approached. Teachers would hurry past during incidents, their eyes carefully averted, as if witnessing the bullying might somehow make them responsible for stopping it. There was one exception, though. Zoe Martinez had been one of the first students to actually speak to Wren when she'd arrived at Roosevelt. Zoe was everything Wren wasn't: confident, outgoing, with long dark hair and an infectious smile that lit up any room she entered. She was involved in student government, had a leading role in the upcoming school play, and somehow managed to be popular without being cruel. When Zoe had invited Wren to sit with her and her friends at lunch during her first week, it had felt like a lifeline. "Just ignore them," Zoe advised after witnessing one of Blake's public humiliation sessions in the cafeteria. "They're just insecure bullies trying to make themselves feel important. Everyone knows Blake peaked in high school, and he's terrified of what happens when he graduates and discovers the real world doesn't care about his football stats." Wren appreciated Zoe's support, but she also noticed how her new friend's expression would tighten with worry whenever Blake's attention turned their way. Zoe was brave enough to sit with Wren and include her in conversations, but she was also smart enough to recognize the precarious nature of high school social dynamics. Speaking out too forcefully against Blake could easily make her a target as well. For 6 weeks, Wren endured the daily harassment with gritted teeth and careful self-control. Every instinct her uncle had trained into her screamed at her to fight back, to show these bullies that she wasn't the helpless victim they assumed her to be. But she forced herself to remember why she'd chosen this path. She wanted to be normal, to prove to herself that she could solve problems without violence, that she could build a life that didn't revolve around her ability to hurt other people. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in late November. The weather had turned cold, and most students were bundled up in heavy coats and jackets as they moved between buildings. Wren was walking to her last class of the day when she heard Zoe's voice behind her, raised in obvious distress. "Stop it, Blake, just leave me alone." Wren turned to see Blake cornering Zoe near the entrance to the gymnasium, with Tyler and Mason flanking him like bodyguards. Blake had apparently decided that Wren's friendship with Zoe made her a legitimate target for his attention, and he was standing uncomfortably close to her, his bulk making her look even smaller than usual. "Come on, Zoe," Blake was saying, his voice carrying that fake, friendly tone that everyone at Roosevelt had learned to fear. "I'm just asking why you waste your time with freaks like Ghost Girl over there. Someone like you could be hanging out with people who actually matter." "Wren is my friend," Zoe replied firmly, though Wren could hear the tremor in her voice. "And she's worth 10 of you." Blake's expression darkened at the rejection, and Wren felt her stomach clench with a familiar combination of anger and dread. She'd seen that look before, in other bullies at other schools, and she knew it meant the situation was about to escalate beyond simple verbal harassment. "You know what I think," Blake said, reaching out to grab the sleeve of Zoe's jacket. "I think you need better friends. Maybe I should help you with that." The next few seconds happened in a blur that Wren would replay in her mind hundreds of times afterwards. Blake yanked hard on Zoe's jacket, and she stumbled forward, crying out in surprise and pain. Tyler and Mason moved closer, forming a tight circle that blocked the view of passing students and teachers. Wren could see the fear in Zoe's eyes as she tried to pull away from Blake's grip, and something inside her chest snapped like a taut wire, finally reaching its breaking point. "Hey!" Wren called out, her voice carrying across the hallway with more force than anyone had ever heard from her before. "Let her go!" Blake turned toward her with an expression of amused surprise, as if a mouse had suddenly started roaring. "Well, well," he said, still maintaining his grip on Zoe's jacket. Ghost Girl finally found her voice. "What are you going to do about it, skeleton? Call your mommy." Ren walked toward the group with steady, measured steps, her hands relaxed at her sides in a way that would have been recognizable to anyone with martial arts training. For the first time in months, she felt the familiar calm settling over her mind, the state her uncle had taught her to find when conflict became unavoidable. "I'm asking you nicely," she said, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the suddenly silent hallway. "Let go of her jacket and walk away." Blake laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the lockers. "Or what? You'll disappear on me?" He gave Zoe's jacket another sharp tug, and she stumbled again, tears of frustration and embarrassment starting to form in her eyes. "Or I'll make you let go," Ren replied simply. The crowd of students that had been pretending not to notice the confrontation suddenly found themselves openly staring. This was unprecedented territory. No one challenged Blake Morrison, especially not tiny girls who looked like they couldn't intimidate a house cat. Blake released Zoe's jacket and took a step toward Ren, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. "You want to go, Ghost Girl? You want to dance? Let's see what you've got." He reached out to grab the front of Ren's jacket, probably intending to lift her off her feet or slam her against the lockers in front of the gathered crowd. Instead, Ren's training took over with muscle memory that had been honed through thousands of hours of practice. She sidestepped Blake's reaching hands with fluid grace, grabbed his extended wrist with both of her hands, and used his own momentum to send him stumbling forward off balance. Before he could recover, she pivoted on her left foot and drove her right elbow into his solar plexus with precise, controlled force. Blake doubled over, gasping for air, and Ren smoothly transitioned into a hip toss that sent all 6'1" of him crashing to the hallway floor. The sound of Blake's body hitting the linoleum echoed through the suddenly silent corridor like a gunshot. For a moment, nobody moved. Tyler and Mason stood frozen in disbelief, their mouths hanging open as they stared at their supposedly invincible leader sprawled on the floor, struggling to catch his breath. Then Tyler snapped out of his shock and charged toward Ren with a wrestler's aggressive tackle. She waited until the last possible second before stepping aside and using his own momentum to guide him face first into the metal lockers with a resounding crash. Mason hesitated for a crucial moment, clearly uncertain whether he wanted to be the next person to test this suddenly dangerous girl, and that hesitation cost him any advantage he might have had. Ren didn't wait for him to make up his mind. She closed the distance between them in 2 quick steps and delivered a precise strike to the nerve cluster in his shoulder, causing his entire arm to go numb and sending him stumbling backward into the growing crowd of spectators. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds, but the reversal was so complete and so shocking that it felt like the whole world had shifted on its axis. Blake was still on the floor, his face red with exertion and humiliation as he struggled to get his breathing back under control. Tyler was slumped against the lockers, holding his nose and checking his fingers for blood. Mason was flexing his arm experimentally, trying to get feeling back into his shoulder while staring at Ren with a mixture of fear and respect that she'd never seen directed toward her before. The crowd of students pressed closer, their voices rising in excited whispers as they processed what they'd just witnessed. Phones appeared as if by magic, recording the aftermath of the confrontation, ensuring that news of Blake Morrison's defeat would spread through Roosevelt High's social media networks within minutes. Ren stood in the center of it all, her breathing calm and controlled, not even breathing hard, despite having just taken down 3 athletes who collectively outweighed her by more than 200 pounds. She looked down at Blake, who was finally starting to push himself up off the floor, his face a mask of rage and embarrassment. For a moment, she saw herself as her uncle had trained her to be, a weapon, capable of inflicting serious damage on anyone who crossed her. Blake was vulnerable now, off balance and struggling to regain his footing. She could have ended the confrontation with a strike to his throat or a knee to his face, could have humiliated him as thoroughly as he had humiliated her and dozens of other students over the years. Instead, she took a step back and extended her hand to help him up. "We're done here," she said quietly, her voice carrying to every corner of the hallway. "All of us. This doesn't happen again." Blake stared at her outstretched hand for a long moment, his pride warring with the reality of his situation. Around them, the crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see how the former king of Roosevelt High would respond to this unprecedented gesture of mercy from someone he'd spent weeks tormenting. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat, and he accepted her help getting to his feet. He dusted off his Letterman jacket with shaking hands, his face still flushed with embarrassment. But when he met Wren's eyes, there was something different there. Not friendship exactly, but a grudging respect that hadn't existed before. "Yeah," he said, his voice hoarse and uncertain. "We're done." Tyler and Mason gathered themselves up without a word, their own humiliation complete as they flanked their defeated leader. The three of them walked away through the crowd of students, who parted like the Red Sea to let them pass, and Wren knew instinctively that this particular dynamic would never be repeated. Zoe appeared at her side, her eyes wide with amazement and gratitude. "Wren, that was incredible. Where did you learn to do that?" "My uncle taught me," Wren replied simply, finally allowing herself to smile. "He always said the best fight is the one you don't have to finish." The crowd was already beginning to disperse, but Wren could feel the change in how they looked at her. The whispered conversations followed her as she gathered her books and headed to her last class of the day, but the tone was completely different now. Instead of dismissive snickers or carefully averted gazes, she heard respect in their voices, curiosity about this quiet girl who had just redefined the social order of Roosevelt High with a 30-second display of skill and restraint. Word of the confrontation spread through the school with the speed that only high school gossip could achieve. By Monday morning, the story had taken on mythic proportions, with some versions claiming that Wren had thrown Blake through a window or that she was secretly a ninja trained by an ancient master. The truth was somehow both more and less dramatic than the rumors. She was just a girl who had learned to defend herself and finally chose to do so when someone she cared about was threatened. Blake and his crew maintained a careful distance from both Wren and Zoe in the weeks that followed. The dynamic shift was visible to everyone at Roosevelt High. The former bullies now walked the hallways with considerably less swagger, their attention focused on students they considered safer targets, which meant that their reign of terror had effectively ended. Other students began approaching Wren with a new kind of respect, some asking about martial arts training, others simply wanting to be associated with someone who had stood up to the school's most notorious bullies. 3 weeks after the confrontation, Blake appeared at Wren's locker as she was packing up her books at the end of the school day. She tensed automatically, her body preparing for another potential conflict, but his posture was completely different from their previous encounters. His shoulders were relaxed, his hands visible and non-threatening, and his expression was uncertain rather than aggressive. "Hey," he said awkwardly, clearly struggling with words that didn't come naturally to him. I should probably..." He stopped and took a deep breath, looking more vulnerable than Wren had ever seen him. "I'm sorry for all of it. The way I treated you, the way I treated Zoe, all the other people I've been a jerk to. You could have really hurt me that day, and you didn't. I don't know why, but thank you." Wren studied his face carefully, looking for signs of deception or sarcasm, but found only genuine remorse and confusion. Blake Morrison was clearly struggling to understand how showing mercy to a defeated enemy could be more powerful than crushing them completely. "Everyone deserves a chance to be better than they were," she replied simply. Even you. He nodded slowly, as if testing the weight of that concept. Tyler and Mason. They're talking about transferring schools. They think everyone here sees them differently now. Maybe that's not a bad thing, Ren said. Maybe it's a chance for them to figure out who they want to be when they're not following your lead. Blake winced at the implication, but he didn't argue with it. What about you? Are you going to join the martial arts club or something? Everyone's talking about how you should teach self-defense classes. Ren considered the question seriously. For months, she'd been trying to build a life that didn't revolve around her fighting skills, but the events of recent weeks had shown her that running from that part of herself wasn't the answer either. Maybe, she said finally, but only if it's about helping people protect themselves, not about hurting others. There's a difference? There's always a difference, Ren replied. The difference is in knowing when to stop. Blake nodded again, more confidently this time, and Ren could see him processing this new way of thinking about power and strength. He thanked her again, awkwardly but sincerely, and walked away, leaving her alone at her locker with a sense of closure she hadn't expected to find. The rest of her senior year at Roosevelt High passed with a kind of quiet respect that Ren had never experienced before. She did end up helping to start a self-defense club, teaching basic techniques to students who wanted to learn how to protect themselves without becoming aggressors. Zoe became her closest friend and eventually her girlfriend, their relationship built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than social convenience. Most importantly, Ren learned that her uncle had been right about more than just fighting techniques. The strongest person in any conflict wasn't necessarily the one who could inflict the most damage, but the one who knew when mercy was more powerful than violence, when showing restraint took more courage than throwing a punch. Standing up for yourself didn't mean becoming a bully. It meant finding the strength to protect what mattered while refusing to let that strength corrupt who you chose to be.